Aloha and welcome to a Hana Kakou, which means let's work together. We're a weekly program on the ThinkTech Hawaii broadcast network going out across the world from beautiful Hawaii. My name is Keli'i Akina. I'm the president of the Grassroot Institute of Hawaii. And today we're going to look at some similarities and differences between our situation here in Hawaii and in the state of Ohio. My guest today is a fellow think tank head in Ohio at the Buckeye Institute, Robert Alt, and along with him we've got Malia Blom-Hill, who is the policy director of the Grassroot Institute of Hawaii, and she's broadcasting from the East Coast in Washington, D.C. Robert is in Ohio. Robert, welcome to the program. Good to have you today.
Thanks for having me on.
Terrific. You lead the Buckeye Institute, which is part of the network of policy think tanks across the country. How long have you been doing this kind of work, Robert?
I've been doing it for about 20 years. In terms of the Buckeye Institute, I've been there about a year and a half.
So you're recent, but you've had some significant accomplishments during your tenure, and we're going to talk a little bit about that. Glad you're with us. Aloha, Malia, from home here in Hawaii.
Hi, always a pleasure. Thank you for having me again.
Well, you do great policy work, and our viewers can readily sign up for any one of our newsletters that Malia edits. You get 3 research papers or articles a week. You get this television program and some commentary on some of the most important issues. So Malia, I'm glad you're joining us today. And this really is a 3-way conversation. Now, once in a while, people who do public policy get together and we talk with language that would be utterly repulsive to most people in the world, if not impenetrable. So we're going to try to do something today that we try to major in as much as possible, and that is to be understandable and to make sense. How does that sound, folks? Sound good to you, Robert?
You know, I'll do my best to leave the legal jargon at the door.
Well, terrific. But you do a lot of great work over there at the Buckeye Institute. Tell us just real quickly about the mission and purpose of Buckeye. Why does it exist and why is it important?
Well, we've been in existence now. This is our 25th year, and what we try and do is bring free market principles to the policymaking in Ohio to make it an environment that encourages job growth and development and allows individuals to start small businesses, allows individuals to send their children to the school of their choice. In general, to promote policies that promote freedom in Ohio. And we tend to think that that's particularly important. I'm sure even out in Hawaii, every 4 years you're inundated with the images from Ohio as Ohio takes its position in terms of being the quintessential swing state in choosing the president.
Absolutely.
You know,
in fact,
so
we
and
think
a big, huge issue.
We envy you from Hawaii because by the time our votes are counted, while our polls are still open, the result is always finished. Ohio plays a big role in that. But we at least have the pride of knowing that we are the birthplace of the President of the United States, or the current president. Now, Robert, you were talking about some important values, and I want to ask Malia to weigh in on them. You spoke about freedom. And you spoke about freedom in 2 dimensions, in terms of individual liberty, the kinds of freedoms that, of course, are guaranteed by the Constitution of the United States, the Bill of Rights. But you also spoke about economic freedom in the sense of businesses and companies being able to prosper and flourish without unworthwhile intervention of the government. Malia, tell us a little bit about our take on those issues at the Grassroot Institute.
Well, you know, we have a very similar sort of mission, although I think how we exercise it would be very different because of our own challenges in our state. But Grassroot very much focuses on both individual liberty in terms of freedoms as outlined by the Constitution and such, and economic freedom. In our case, we look a lot at government regulation and government overreach. I think all free market think tanks do look at that, and I think some states maybe a little more expansive than others. We'll say Hawaii being one of those ones where the government does often tend to look for places to expand. So we look a lot at a sort of watchdog into government accountability and government infringing upon economic and individual freedoms.
Robert, how would you measure or talk about the economic freedom in the state of Ohio? What do you look at? What do you see there when we think of the freer market? You mentioned free market, and I often like to use the term freer market. Go ahead.
Well, in terms of that, I mean, obviously there's different benchmarks you can look to, but one of the things we look to are we being competitive with the states immediately around us? If you were looking to start a small business, would you want to come to Ohio, or would you want to go to Indiana or Michigan on our borders? Would you want to go to Tennessee or Kentucky or to Pennsylvania? And in some counts, we've certainly improved. We're lowering the tax. We've lowered the individual income tax rate, and we've increased school choice, for instance, on the individual liberty perspective. But in other counts, we're still lagging behind. We're still not a right-to-work state. We're still a state in which individuals can be forced to join a union for the privilege of working. We still actually have, when you take a look at the total tax burden, our total tax burden is still very high, and the tax code is way too complex, and it puts significant burdens on small businesses. We actually have a system of municipal income taxes, which would probably even shock the regulators in Hawaii. We have more taxing jurisdictions than any state outside of Pennsylvania, with over 600 different jurisdictions that can apply income tax. So there's a number of areas where we've got a lot of work left to do.
Well, Robert, there are a lot of similarities. Hawaii is a changing state. We have made some progress in terms of some of the markers you're making, but we have a very long way to go. You mentioned the maze of municipal taxes that you experience in the counties and the cities in Ohio. You are ahead of us in terms of taxes on the books, but here in Hawaii, when you count items that are called fees that you have to pay and have no choice about it if you want things like water, we're up there with you. Malia, are there one or two of the issues that Robert brought up that you find compellingly similar to what we're experiencing in Hawaii?
It's interesting because, Hawaii, we started the slow economic recovery, and, this issue of competitiveness, where do you fit? It's a little more difficult for us because of our location. It changes how people approach doing business in Hawaii. It also gives Hawaii businesses a lot fewer options in many ways. We talked about taxation stuff. One of the things that Hawaii has, one of our taxation frustrations, is that we have a general excise tax rather than a sales tax, which is progressive and, taxes things at pretty much every level along the chain of supply. It's a huge problem for our businesses, and it's a huge problem in attracting business to Hawaii. One of the other things, to my great frustration, one of the things that was keeping us more competitive, that contributed to our good economic outlook for the next year, was the fact that we hadn't mucked around with minimum wage. And so, almost as if called to do it, the legislature this session went ahead and instituted a higher minimum wage. So, we're concerned about, these this promising beginnings, this idea that, perhaps we're becoming more economically competitive, hemmed in by actions of government that, tamp down on the entrepreneurial impulse, hurt small businesses, and depress the economic expansion. So.
One of the issues that you mentioned, the minimum wage, is a good one for us to dwell upon for just a moment, because it helps us to understand the role that think tanks like the Buckeye Institute and the Grassroot Institute, which are part of a national network called the State Policy Network, the role that we play in terms of providing information, in terms of providing an alternate perspective to our states. A few programs ago, we were speaking with some folks in China who are involved in the think tank movement there. And one of the interesting things we noted, especially with a think tank in Hong Kong, is that everything seems to be going fine since Hong Kong transferred back into the People's Republic of China, except for one thing they lament, and that was about 3 years ago, they were required to adopt a minimum wage law. And what was interesting when I visited and spoke with some economists in Hong Kong about this, they said, well, the good thing is that it really has very little effect because most of the wage earners are not even at the minimum wage. But it was a symbolic act in many ways, led by the unions, to show some kind of patriotism to what goes on in China. But what I was most interested in hearing is that these economists in Hong Kong and in Beijing as well, at a think tank there, said that the global case is absolutely proven, that minimum wages do not help raise money for the government. They do not help business climate, and they end up resulting in underemployment and unemployment. So with that said, Robert, what's the minimum wage situation in Ohio?
Well, I think like so many states, there is almost a constant drumbeat by progressive think tanks and by progressives in the state to increase the minimum wage. And of course, we've had a recent calls for that in Washington as well.
Yes.
At least each month, I'm contacted by the Cleveland Plain Dealer, which is a major publication in northern Ohio, asking our opinion about proposals to increase the minimum wage. And the response is always the same. If you take a look, the results, even Obama's own one of his chief economists has conceded in an academic article that raising the minimum wage has negative effects on employment among low-income individuals. And to propose something like this at a time when so many states are still struggling in their recovery, and in particular, the groups that tend to be struggling the most are, the young and the minority populations. The unemployment rates are much higher in Ohio. African American males between the ages of 18 and 24 have a much higher unemployment rate than the general population. And so doing something like raising the minimum wage, which is going to make it more difficult to get jobs, it's going to reduce the number of jobs available, it's going to increase the barriers to entry, which is to say, if you're a small business owner and you have to pay that much more to hire someone, you're going to be looking for someone who perhaps has work experience. You're not going to be looking to give someone a break who maybe hasn't had a job before. This is going to hurt the very people who the progressives claim they're seeking to help. And so this is very misguided policy, whether it's in Ohio or whether it's in Hawaii.
Well, when we come back after a short break, Robert, I would like to talk a little bit more with you about the perspective that we have in the state think tanks of protecting the powers, the freedoms of the individual states. And with respect to the minimum wage law, it's no secret that there has been a federal push from the current administration to have individual states lead the way as part of a campaign to get a federal minimum wage up to beyond $10 per hour. And yet we have some distinct perspectives on that. I'm Keli'i Akina with the Grassroot Institute of Hawaii. I'm talking with Robert Alt, president of the Buckeye Institute, a sister organization in Ohio, and our policy director, Malia Blom-Hill, who's in Washington, D.C. now. We'll be right back, and one of the things we're going to talk about, I'll ask Robert in particular, is to share with us what's gone on in his state in terms of finding solutions to an imbalance between unionized school system or teachers' unions and other alternatives. We'll be right back after this short break.
Hello, I'm Martin Despang, and I'm the host together with the one and only Ali Yamashita, and our show is called Urban Transcendence. And Urban Transcendence is about identifying where we have a unique situation of a vibrant city in one of the most beautiful natural environments. So how these two can coincide, sometimes conflict, how they could find reciprocity in the 21st century is what we're excited about. And we're planning on bringing in a diverse body of guests, both from the arts and the science and the established and the wise and the emerging generation. So hope you will join us. We'll always be on Thursdays from 1 to 2 p.m. Thank you.
Aloha and welcome back to a Hana Kakou on the ThinkTech Hawaii Broadcast Network. I want to give a big mahalo to Jay Fidel, producer of the ThinkTech Broadcast Network. We are seeing about 20 or more hours a week of original content produced here largely by Jay and a wonderful group of volunteers. And so my hat's off to all of you who are producing good content that goes out across the world about Hawaii and the world. My guest today is Robert Alt, who leads a think tank in Ohio called the Buckeye Institute. We're sister organizations here with the Grassroot Institute of Hawaii, and I have Malia Hill, our policy director, online as well. Robert, we were just talking before the end of the first segment about the fact that there's a distinct perspective that we have as states. Recently, we've seen a couple of very strong federal measures. One of them was successful, at least in terms of the startup of implementing it, not so much successful in its outcomes, but the politics was there in order to give our nation an Affordable Care Act, which for the most part has come in and replaced systems that many states have had in place and worked well. In Hawaii, we had 93 to 96% health care coverage of our population through private and government partnerships. Another measure that is still not decided, but is a federal initiative, is the increase of the minimum wage to beyond $10 an hour. And yet, one of the things that we can see happen that keeps freedoms, both economically and individually, is when states themselves do more for themselves, depending less on the federal government and being interfered with less by the federal government. And when we as states compete with one another to come up with better solutions, a kind of a free market in ingenuity and innovation. You play a big role in that at your state think tank. What are your thoughts on the state perspective that we have, Robert?
Well, no, I mean, certainly when we talked earlier about the sort of questions, whether it's taxation, whether it's minimum wage, and what it is that you would do if you're opening a business. Now, I recognize that Hawaii is unique geographically, but certainly for states in the continental U.S., you have, I think, a very robust competition when it comes time for the question of where it is that you're going to establish your business, where it is that you as your family are going to live. You may not feel like you've got that kind of competition internationally, but most Americans feel like if they're not getting a good shake in the state they're in, if they're able to get a job in another state, that they're willing to go ahead and vote with their feet. They're willing to go and see who actually is doing the right policy. And you see this all the time. Why is it that more and more people ultimately end up retiring to Florida? It ends up being because of their favorable income tax rate, which makes it very attractive to retirees. Texas is experiencing the same thing in terms of individuals going there because they've experimented with public policy, with tax rates that end up making it very favorable to individuals to settle down there. And you see this in migration patterns. Unfortunately, Ohio, as a state, for a long time has been a state that's losing population to other states. And that's been a function of the fact that other states have passed us by. They're being more innovative. So what Buckeye tries to do is to make sure that we're actually promoting the sorts of policies here in Ohio that will make it a hospitable place for people to come and settle down. And that includes the minimum wage issue. If we crank up the minimum wage too high, it's going to be very difficult for individuals to get to that first rung in the ladder, to get those initial jobs that allow them to move up the ladder to success.
Absolutely. And we are also able to come up with greater innovations as to solving our own problems and compete with other states, and that's part of a competitive federalism. Today, unfortunately, that word federalism may invoke big federal government, but as you know, Robert and Malia, the whole concept of federalism is a small government, a minimal government needed to keep us together as a nation and serve needs that states can't serve. But for the most part, we are to be competitive states. Now, Malia, It's interesting, having lived in Hawaii and being from Hawaii, you might want to weigh in on Robert's statement that it's harder for people to vote with their feet in Hawaii, whereas moving from one state to another state across a state line could be relatively easy with your U-Haul van and so forth. That's a little bit difficult here in Hawaii, and so how are we impacted?
It does contribute because, in a sense, like Hawaii, I mean, like Ohio, what we get is a bit of a brain drain. If we can't keep our, best and brightest, if there's something better to be offered, we don't have much to offer, and that goes past just economy into, where are you raising your children? What are the schools like? What is the potential as a business? We could be in, with places like Texas and Florida and Tyrese, but do we really make it friendly? Even when it comes to things like ours, it's a place where the government could help the state be more competitive. Instead, we get, and I don't want to drag this out and talk about hotel taxes and such, but these places where Hawaii is competitive, where we should have this natural advantage. Because it's beautiful. People want to come here. Do we give our industry, do we give our business, are we competitive? Do we do what we can to make it a more attractive place to visit or to come or to stay? Or are we kind of doing what we can to push people out?
That's right. You talk about the brain drain, and so in a sense, there is mobility. Unfortunately, it may not be the kind of mobility that we want. We do have money in the form of disposable income of people leaving our state and migrating to places like Las Vegas or Texas and so forth, leaving the state. And we have a different kind of mobility it is becoming well known that Hawaii has the highest per capita compensation to people on welfare in the nation. An average mother of one who is on the welfare system in Hawaii receives approximately $69,000 per year in benefits. And so that produces a certain kind of mobility. I suppose the concept, if you build it, they will come, is something that we would like to apply to better tax policy and the ability to start businesses and be robust in them. I want to go back to Robert now. There is another similarity between Hawaii and Ohio, and I'd like to hear your dealings in terms of trying to find solutions to this. In the state of Hawaii, we have a single school district for the entire state, but what I'm looking at right now is that we have a single union of teachers here that all teachers pretty much need to be part of if they're going to work in the school system. What's your situation in Ohio, and how have you been dealing with that?
Well, in Ohio, once again, we've got we're not a right-to-work state, which means that school districts can enter into collective bargaining agreements with the teachers' unions, which create closed shops, which require individuals to join the union for the privilege of working there. And we have that, unfortunately, at far too many of the schools. We've got over 600 school districts throughout the state. And far too many of them are teetering on the edge of insolvency. This despite the fact that we're spending more and more money, we're throwing more and more money at educating our children, and unfortunately we're just not seeing results for those dollars. And part of that goes to the fact that many of these dollars are not really going into into anything particularly new in terms of educating the children. It's going into increasing benefits packages for teachers. It's going into very generous pension plans, more generous oftentimes than can be afforded. It's going into a series of salaries and benefits which end up oftentimes pushing the school districts to the edge of their capacity, even before they begin to pay for anything like transporting children or the facilities. And so this has created serious issues. A number of years ago, Ohio went ahead and tried to address some of these concerns with regard to collective bargaining, and I don't know if you all like those motivational posters that are up on so many walls. I personally hate them, but I find that the demotivational posters, those are actually very useful. And there's one that shows a ship listing, sort of perpendicular to the waves, quickly sinking. And the caption on the bottom is, "Maybe your purpose in life was to serve as a warning to others." And sometimes I feel that's the lesson of Ohio. We attempted to put together a series of reforms as a state, and we made a number of mistakes in terms of how it is that we approach the question, including rather than doing right to work, we ended up limiting collective bargaining rights. We went ahead and included the police and firefighters. There were any number of mistakes, but perhaps most of all, we talked about sort of the cold, hard numbers, but we didn't talk about how it is that these union policies, they don't just affect the children, they affect the lives of the teachers. They affect the lives of the individuals who have strong religious, political, moral objections, perhaps to joining an organization that may take very different stances on political, religious, other beliefs than they do. I'll tell you the story of a woman named Carol. She ended up suing her school district suing her union because her school district entered into a collective bargaining agreement which forced her to join the union. And she had a religious objection to joining that union. And in the course of her case, attempting to get an exemption, she honestly felt that, quite frankly, if she was forced to join this union, it would end up violating her religious principles. In the course of doing this, she asked the general counsel of the top lawyer of the union, "Isn't there any way that I could possibly get an exemption? I'll go ahead and pay the funds that I would pay. I'll pay them to a charity, but I can't go ahead and support these policies." And the general counsel laughed at her and explained, "Your religion doesn't qualify for an exemption. If you want an exemption, you're going to have to change your religion. You should not have to sue or change your religion in order to carry out your rights of conscience." And so part of what we're doing is making sure that every individual, whether it's the teacher, whether it's the students, they're able to pursue education. They're able to have a job, but not be forced to be associated with an organization that may, in fact, take stances that are inimical to what it is that they believe.
Robert, I'm going to pause you right there, and we're going to take a short break. And I'd like to come back and hear a little more of some remarkable things that Buckeye has been involved in to see some change move along the way. Again, this is a Hana, Kakou, a weekly program on the ThinkTech Hawaii Broadcast Network. My guest, Robert Alt of the Buckeye Institute in Ohio, and Malia Blom-Hill, part of the Grassroot Institute. We'll be right back after this short break.
I'm Jay Fidel. That's Sharon Moriwaki of the Hawaii Energy Policy Forum. And every Wednesday we have Hawaii, the State of Clean Energy. We've been doing it for some time now, and we have some fantastic guests on there, unbelievable guests who give us insight into what is going on in a very complex, sometimes very confusing, sometimes very disappointing area of progress in the state. So we love doing this. We love meeting them. We love talking to them. We love having their ideas out on the table. So maybe, just maybe, we can all make some sense of what's going on. Sharon, what do you think?
I think that's absolutely correct. We enjoy ourselves meeting with all these people and hearing about the energy and the state of clean energy, and hopefully we advance clean energy for the state. So it's terrific. Join us.
Okay, it's every Wednesday. Okay, Wednesday is Energy Day. Every Wednesday, 4 to 5 p.m. Hawaii, the State of Clean Energy, here on ThinkTech Hawaii. We'll see you there. I'm Jake.
Aloha and welcome back to ThinkTech Hawaii Broadcast Network. I'm Keli'i Akina with the Grassroot Institute. This is a weekly program with movers and shakers called a Hana, Kakou. Today I'm talking with Robert Alt, of the Buckeye Institute in Ohio, and Malia Blom-Hill, part of the Grassroot Institute. We'll be right back after this short break. president of the Buckeye Institute in Ohio, who works for free markets, individual liberty, and limited accountable government, just like we do at the Grassroot Institute. And Malia Blom-Hill from the East Coast is chiming in on our conversation today. She's our policy director. Robert, what are some of the strategies that Buckeye is implementing in order to loosen up the hold in your state that the union has in terms of teachers? Have you seen any results starting?
Well, I think much like in Hawaii, it is it's an uphill battle, and it's one that we're continuing to fight. But part of it, I think, is just recognizing that the need to understand where it is that people stand on these particular questions. When the issue went to the voters a few years ago, after there'd been some restrictions placed on collective bargaining, the 77% of Ohioans who ended up voting to undo some reforms that had been put in place by the legislature, they said that they did so because they found that the restrictions were unfair to union members. And so I think it ends up being fundamental that we need to understand and we need to respect the rights of individuals to join unions, but also respect the rights of individuals not to be forced to join a union, not to be forced to end up adopting views which are contrary to what it is that they may believe. Respecting the conscience of every individual and not restricting the right of an individual to work based upon whether or not they've chosen to join a union. So a lot of what we're doing is making sure that we educate people on these issues to lay the foundation for future reform.
I hear that part of what you're talking about is based on principle, the principle of protecting the individual liberties and choices of citizens, and that's certainly part of it. But there's also a pragmatic side to it that benefits the economy, that benefits society, and that is that when there is competition and people have choices as to where they send their children to school or as to where they work and so forth, we inevitably, through this spirit of competitive enterprise, free enterprise, produce better products and give people better options. So that's all good. Now, Malia, our situation in Hawaii is similar. Would you like to comment on that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it was Fordham said a few years ago, the Hawaii State Teachers Union is very possibly the strongest teachers union of all 50 states. And it's a matter of interest to me in how successful you are, because I don't want to say undermining, but I want to say sort of having people think differently about unions. The move towards unions in Hawaii, I think Keli'i might have called them sacred earlier, and it is almost that. There's a cultural influence at stake. It's so much a part of the history, and I think when it comes to the teachers union in particular, there are some other cultural and Asian influence in Hawaii that gives it extra weight. And with all due respect to teachers and everything they do, when it comes to policy, especially policy that gives more power to parents and students, the teachers union has become pretty much just an extremely strong, very difficult opposition to almost any education reform in Hawaii. It's they push very hard, not only in the collective bargaining, and in Hawaii, collective bargaining is in our constitution, so there's another layer to it that makes it even more difficult. But when we look at it and we say, well, if we're going to make a difference in education reform here in Hawaii, how do we talk to people about unions? I know that Ohio has a very strong union culture too, so I'd be kind of interested in knowing, how have you talked to people about unions? Have you managed to change that culture at all, or at least have people look at it differently?
Well, that's a great handoff to Robert, and I'm just going to add this and then give it to Robert. In the State Policy Network think tanks, whether it's Grassroot Institute in Hawaii or Buckeye Institute, we're not looking to stand on extremes. We're looking to find workable solutions So, for example, in Hawaii, we're not looking to end the unions nor to in any way denigrate the tremendous historical and cultural value that they have established in terms of empowering people of all backgrounds in ways they weren't empowered before. But as time goes on, as power amasses, as certain functions become obsolete that are taken over elsewhere, and for a host of other reasons, there needs to be an updating. There needs to be a balance and so forth. So Robert, as you respond to Malia's question, I'd just like to add this dimension. What are some steps that we all can take to win the public over to an updating of a situation like the unions have given to us over the years and decades?
Well, I think part of it is just recognizing sort of the change that we're already seeing within unions. If you take a look, and I presume it's the same in Hawaii as it is across the country, most of the sectors of the unions that are growing end up being the public sector unions rather than the private sector unions. And many of the protections that they're seeking are already protected as a matter of law, and the lawmakers already have sort of pretty strong interests in protecting the workers' rights of individuals who work for the union or who work for the government. And so, some of the questions just end up being, if you take a look, for instance, at the cost of government, the degree to which unions end up driving up, when you talked about sort of the economics of it, the degree to which unions end up increasing the cost of government doing business in ways. But in terms of how it is that we reach out to individuals, I think Malia made a very strong argument and the right case that this isn't about, as did you, this isn't about denigrating unions. This isn't about undoing unions or stopping unions. This is about respecting people on both sides of the aisle, giving people the right to choose. And I think that that's what people need to understand at the end of the day. This comes down to, should you be forced to join a union, or should you be given a choice? Yes. Should you be forced to associate with a particular set of ideas, or should you have the freedom to choose, what candidates you support, what ideas you support, and how it is you support them? And I think that's really ultimately what we're talking about in these cases. The one area where I think we have made a lot of progress by comparison to Hawaii, I think, is in school choice. Ohio has long been a leader in providing school choice, and part of that, it began with a program to help out some of the worst schools that we had in the state, which were among the worst in the country in terms of really poorly serving some of our lower income and minority communities in the inner city. And the legislature prudently went ahead and said, you know what, we're going to give these kids a ticket out. We're going to give them the opportunity to get a scholarship, a voucher that they can use to go ahead and go to a school of choice. And the lawsuit over that program, which was they were sued by the unions, is the one that went up to the Supreme Court and established that other states could go ahead and do this program. So Ohio has a long history of supporting school choice. We still have a long way to go. And the unions do tend to be very opposed to it on very parochial grounds, because oftentimes the private or particularly private religious schools either aren't unionized or aren't subject to unionization in certain cases, and so they're really trying to protect their market share rather than necessarily protecting the education of the children.
And I think that when you put it in economic terms, protecting market share, you hit the nail on the head. Here in Hawaii, as well as elsewhere throughout the nation, where school choice, the opportunity for parents to choose the kind of education they want their children to have and to use their tax dollars to pay for that, it has not advanced very far. And part of the reason is the economics of big systems. But I appreciate the fact that you underscored that ultimately there's a value. And the value is whether we empower people to control the choices that they make, whether we empower people to say, this is how I want my child to be educated. And I think that the more that we educate along those lines, the greater progress we can make. One last thing, Robert. There is a cost, however, and this is part of our argument, that the state-controlled system or the system that requires unions, requires teachers to be part of unions, doesn't produce the best economic or academic results. And this has contributed to a very inefficient situation wherein many states, because of the overhead needed to pay for pension plans as well as health programs for state employees, and in Hawaii, the teachers union is a big portion of that. These have generated unfunded liabilities. In the state of Hawaii, the unfunded liabilities for state sponsored healthcare system or the state employee pension system, they add up to $42 billion. And nationwide, the unfunded liabilities of all the states, you know, Robert, is close to $4 trillion. What's the situation in Ohio, and are there solutions that are being brought to that situation?
Well, like so many states, we've got a state teachers pension system. We also have we've got multiple state-run pension systems. Sort of an interesting microcosm of that is actually the city of Cincinnati has a separate pension system for its public employees, and while not in as bad of a situation as Detroit, it is nonetheless sufficiently underfunded that they've had to try and begin to take some strong medicine. We recommended, in fact, a series of reforms which would include shifting from the current system, a defined benefit system, to the sort of pension system that most people who have private sector jobs are familiar with, something like what you have in a 401k, in which the employee makes a contribution and the employer makes a matching contribution, which limits the long-term liability. And unfortunately, it's very difficult. We have seen states that have been able to show the political courage necessary to go ahead and reform their systems. Utah has done it even when they weren't facing financial ruin. Rhode Island has made some reforms. Alaska has made some reforms. But Ohio is one of those states where, again, the statewide systems and the city of Cincinnati are all facing various degrees of underfunding issues in their pension systems, which are driving up the cost of government, and ultimately are going to be forcing out the potential funds which could be used for other services. If you take a look at the end of the day, the municipalities or the states simply aren't going to be able to provide the level of services if they're having to make up and pay for these underfunding issues.
Well, even as you speak, there are some ideas you've mentioned that are being pursued in Ohio that would certainly bring benefit to our situation in Hawaii, and there may even be some solutions that Hawaii is approaching that can benefit Ohio, and I think that's all part of what takes place when states take responsibility for their own situations rather than relying upon the federal government, and also look to other states for the most competitive ideas. Any last thoughts, Malia, before we close off our program, and then I'll give Robert a minute to say goodbye.
Oh, nothing, just I'm eagerly watching how other states are handling these issues. You know, Hawaii, being Hawaii, we tend to be facing the same sort of problems, but perhaps a step or so behind. And these can be very expensive problems. The unfunded liabilities issue, our sort of slow movement towards education reform and vouchers and all the barriers that have been thrown up in that case. Even something like Jones Act reform is in ways tied to the strength of unions in Hawaii. And all of these have rather significant costs down the road. So I'm very much hoping that the experiences in Ohio, Wisconsin, elsewhere in the U.S. kind of can prevent us from heading to waiting for that moment of crisis before we act.
Thank you for being on board today, Malia. Malia is the Grassroot Institute of Hawaii Policy Director, who is living in exile right now out in Washington, D.C., but we'll be back soon in Hawaii. You. And Robert, last thought.
Well, I really appreciate the approach that you've had today, because I think that we don't move forward. If you take a look at what's happening in Washington, it's we've been met with stalemate now for years, and I don't think we're going to see much of a change in that anytime soon. It ultimately is what led me to come to Ohio a little over a year and a half ago to take over the Buckeye Institute, and I'm sure it's what motivates you in running the Grassroots Institute. The real potential for reform, the real potential for new ideas comes from the states, and there's great opportunities, I think, to learn from what's happening in other states. For Hawaii to learn what's happening in Ohio, and for Ohio to learn what's happening in Hawaii, in order to make lives better for individual citizens. So we need to embrace competitive federalism in order to allow people to live fuller, richer, and freer lives.
Absolutely. Robert, thank you so much for being with us from the Buckeye Institute in Ohio.
Thank you so much.
You've heard today that states can generate solutions, and that's the value of organizations like the Buckeye Institute and the Grassroot Institute, to do the thinking, the research, and to be aware of what works, what doesn't work, and to provide more competitive solutions. I'm Keli'i Akina with the Grassroot Institute, signing off for ThinkTech Hawaii on the ThinkTech Hawaii Broadcast Network. We'll see you next week on Hana Kakou. Aloha.